Thank you. Good afternoon. That was a very powerful presentation from Deb's family. That was amazing. So thank you, Janan, for coming and joining us and sharing that love of your mother and friend. I'm proud to introduce our next speaker. She'll be speaking about tribal hemp and cannabis, reclaiming the plant medicine and the economics from the green future. I'm proud to introduce Mary Jane Oatman.
Himakas katsiya ninam hanyawat piamsik kinawatis pa ka yochwatis pa Inamwat Nitwas, Mary Jane Oatman. I am joining you all from the ancestral homelands of the Nimipu people here in present-day Idaho. It's such an honor to be able to participate, even virtually, in that blessing. Being a young lady brought up in the era of the fish wars, those are my celebrities. All of our advocates and ambassadors for Mother Earth from the time that I was growing up. Those were the idols that my elders taught me to look up to and to read the stories about. And so been very familiar with the work of the entire Abrahamson family, but specifically Deb as a phenomenal matriarch. And so it's quite an honor to present on the heels of such a wonderful recognition of service and servant leadership from Indigenous women, because the reality that we have now to face is that we are operating, the dynamics of our traditional ecological knowledge and our cultural paradigms in a very patriarchal system. So to get our women's voices heard at the table, especially at corporate tables, is something that is very rare. When I was serving under the Obama administration as the National Advisory Council on Indian Education Policy Advisory Council, we were moving forward with the White House Executive Order on American Indian Alaska Native Education. My whole world and background, interfaced with the work of the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, because our Pacific Northwest tribes are known, throughout the globe for standing up for our water, for our fish, and for our lands. And so it was really disheartening for me to return home from Washington, D.C. And see that in 2014, our tribes were left out of opportunities to cultivate hemp under the Farm Bill. And because we were left out, we saw many tribes saying, you know what, we're not going to wait for permission to endure this economic development opportunity. And those tribes saw the long reach of the federal government coming into our communities and shutting down production of fiber industries that predominantly white men were gearing to make millions and billions of dollars off of. And that was really frustrating for me because, well, for one, I'm here in Idaho, and while we also, in parallel with the Farm Bill, we saw many tribes looking towards opening up opportunities for medical access or recreational access as states were opening up to do those activities. So to date, there are 18 states that have a legal form of recreational cannabis and 38 that have versions of medical cannabis. And Idaho is one of those last along to come up with any kind of version, and neither for hemp or cannabis. For the THC cannabis, but the hemp finally did come along. And so in 2021, in February of 2021, the Nez Perce tribe was approved a plan to cultivate hemp under the USDA Farm Bill. But that is, just the small part of the reason why I wanted to be on this advocacy trail. The bigger part is, the reality that biocultural medicines, including hemp, as a medicine as well as a fiber, were not being recognized in a lot of that foundational history of the policy. And I was raised in a very strong home that talked about our plants as medicines and shared stories of the textiles of our people, specifically our women, with that genetic predisposition to have the crooked tooth from working the rope. And our women were master rope makers. That's how we shared and told our stories, since time immemorial, over centuries, curating the process of cultivating the rope, making an economy that made us, players in a world platform. And then when Lewis and Clark made their expedition through here, they did, a couple of very wonderful things along that way. One of those was they archived the presence of our cultural textiles, such as the hemp rope that our women were making. And they also were able to, throughout this journey of documenting all of that, make also specific notes about the cultural practices and traditions of the peace pipe and our smoking and our sacred smoke. And so when I was trying to figure out, what are going to be my next steps in moving forward, being a medicinal cannabis user myself, I knew that I could not always live in the closet. I'd been doing it for far too long. And I knew that there was going to be a lot of negative stigma and shame that all of our tribal communities had to overcome to be able to find some form of economic development as well as health equity in cannabis. And at the same time, I'm like that the biggest opportunities that tribes have is not in the development of cannabis as a recreational retail therapy or providing any of that kind of access. Definitely a lot of opportunity there. But, as a young woman looking at our different land dynamics, realized, wow, we have about 4 million acres of agricultural lands that are not even being utilized. We see those all over our own tribal communities. In your own tribal community, you see those little plots of land where agriculture could be happening, but there's a lot of red tape. And I mean, if we have red tape for cattle farming and for other agricultural areas, I knew that the red tape or the lack of knowledge to how to crosswalk to being able to cultivate and farm in hemp was going to be pretty steep. So I was hoping that my presentation, I don't know if it was pulled up, it's not even up there, but I did have a presentation and I didn't see it. So I just kept to just keep talking and sharing with you all that the reason that I am doing what I'm doing right now, with founding the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, is to be able to get tribes talking and working together. The most proactive work that I've ever been able to see coming out of tribal communities is when there is a lot more collaboration and unity for tribes. And so with the reality that we've got a lot of tribes trying to figure out what they're going to do in hemp cultivation, they're doing it in their different silos, that we needed the opportunity for them to be able to, share their stories. And so that's why the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, to educate Indigenous communities with a for us, by us model, to be able to restore traditional and spiritual use in plant medicines. Go ahead, and the next slide, please. So I started the 10,000 quarterly publication in February of 2020. Of course, like the rest of the nation, not knowing that we were going to be enduring a national pandemic and all of the things that would trickle down from the uncertainty of the national and global pandemic. But I remained dedicated to preserving these stories and capturing them as much as I could. Thank goodness through the technology of places like Zoom, I was able to interview dozens of tribal leaders, elders, plant practitioners, and showcase them in THC magazine. And so we are up to 9 issues that we're working on right now. And it's all about what we're doing as tribes for our communities. Next slide, please. A big part of, as I mentioned earlier, is the economic development that can be had with with the cannabis boom, but many of our indigenous communities, we're still cleaning up from the gold rush. I mean, we still are literally dealing with the depredations from a lack of policy, from a lack of acknowledging the depredations on the environment that are happening with these big boom economies. And so, you know, for us, it's kind of hard to think about the cannabis industry being termed the green rush, because, you know, with that comes more depredations against Mother Earth, water. The communities in Northern California would be great ones to speak to about the things that happen to their waterways and systems from dirty farming practices in cannabis. So much so that a lot of their communities in Northern California, they're not, you know, rushing forward to it because they've seen it as a very negative thing in their community because of the dirty farming practices. Goodness. And so, next slide, please. So we do have, you know, the opportunity to be a lot more vocal in figuring out how we can advance more proactive legislation in marijuana and hemp policy throughout Indian country. Our National Congress of American Indians has been doing this, you know, proactively through the passage of resolutions like SD 15047 at their annual convention. And next slide, please. That's why it is really important that we keep holding these conversations together, and that we are able to open up the opportunities to have the dialogue, because, you know, a lot of our elders are still very much against this development. They just see this as another drug, another problem coming into our communities. That is why I chose print publication for THC Magazine, so that we could get, you know, tangible evidences of change in tribal communities, and have our elders, when our tribal leaders are out interacting in community and going to those national conventions and conferences, that they can actually go back to their community and share out with their tribal councils what specific tribes are doing, how they did it, how they were able to crosswalk the compliance and the regulations and raise the bar. Because that's one thing that we do know, is that we're always under a tremendous amount of scrutiny, especially when it's something new. Nothing unlike what happened during the Indian gaming regulatory era, where it was like tribes were being set up to fail. Things were so complex, and you figure you just create such a complex system. Well, tribes, not only did they meet and exceed, you know, the regulatory scheme, you know, but they you know, they've been thriving, have been able to step back from the you know, the investment types of models that happened in the past, where it was maybe not always the biggest benefit to the tribe. Go ahead, next slide. And so we at the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition know that because a lot of communities are having a hard time talking about this conversation, let alone tribes coming together collectively statewide and having a huge conversation, or regionally, let alone nationally, coming together to have consistent, really consistent conversations, like regular meetings about what's going to happen if we get left out of federal legalization in the United States. It happened to our brothers and sisters up in Canada, despite their advocacy with their Assembly of First Nations, the National Indigenous Medical Cannabis Association, extensive lobbying through their tax commissions to make sure that First Nations communities were not left out. The Cannabis Act in Canada completely left out First Nations communities. They have been forced to develop a red market economy, their own compliance, their own standards, and it was just because they were left out. And so, you know, in looking at why our tribes are not, you know, moving forward here in the United States in a lot of the cultivation areas, it's always, I mean, every single survey that's been done, and I've seen 3 of them so far, it is federally illegal, is the number one reason that tribes are giving to not move forward in cannabis development. However, in the Cannabis Coalition, we are urging to move forward with regulation protection on a proactive manner, because it is not illegal to protect our homelands. So next slide, please. And what we mean by that is there are so many other different opportunities to take a hold of that cannabis economy before it even enters into your land. One of those great ideas that we've seen is, what the Yakima Nation did in Washington State. They made it completely illegal on the Yakima Indian Reservation, and they worked on creating their compliances, their ordinances, and so they will be the sole proprietor of permitting. They are not going to have every Tom, Dick, and Harry popping up with dispensaries on their reservation. They'll shut them down because they want to be able to then license and permit and be the regulatory agency in that, in that area. I think probably one of the strongest ones that I would really like tribes and implore them to explore a lot more, if they are not currently already, or look at amendments, is there are a lot of harmful pesticides and herbicides that are being used as growth stimulants in the cannabis industry, and then they're flushing them out into the water systems. And so if tribes can step in under the EPA tribes as states and, get in there with that presence, with that federal regulatory compliance and enforcement arm, as well as potentially even going in there and amending their list of applicable pesticides and herbicides, so that they can make sure that the build out of the cannabis economy in their communities is a push more towards regenerative farming practices, opportunities where tribal cannabis farmers can get reimbursements for utilizing biochar carbon products in their lands. And then even that's another one of them is the tribes don't even have to be plant touching. There are some of them that are looking into specifically just waste material business. So the bad side of the traditional hemp industry is that there are different waste products that because of how the Farm Bill was written, they can't really do anything else with them outside of once they've stripped out the herd and they've got the bast fibers, and then they have a specific amount of waste. We're seeing communities work collectively to create what do you call that, the biochar, and utilizing it in some of the biomass facilities. And that just leads towards more opportunities in the future as well for, as I was mentioning earlier, some of the NRCF programs to, for carbon on soil. But there's really just, I think, more of an opportunity now than ever for tribes to work collectively together on the domestic fiber production build out. Just as an example, if all of the tribes in Montana were producing fiber, and we had a shipping corridor, and we had maybe a production facility here in the Nez Perce homelands, and we have this direct water corridor, to other tribes along the Northwest, we could be, if we were working in an economies of scale as tribes, leading in the domestic fiber production, because that's the kink everywhere in decortication, large build out facilities just not really happening on a domestic scale. And so a lot of really good opportunities for tribes to lead in that endeavor. But we have to make sure that we keep this conversation really forward thinking in terms of the entire life cycle, because we're talking about cannabis as medicine, treating a lot of mental health issues, depression, anxiety. A lot of those issues they're not inherent in Indigenous culture. They are side effects of things like homelessness and housing insecurity. And so when we talk about domestic fiber production, tribes are really in a position as well, with the vast amounts of funding that we received under the CARES Act. I've read through all 3 different rounds of those budgets, and I'm just baffled to see that in some Alaska Native communities, they got like $1.3 million to build one single family unit home. I'm working with tiny hemp house builders, hemp insulation builders. The Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska is already on commercial scale concrete hempcrete production. And so it's really, I'm trying to just take this step back to figure out what type of a coordinated approach is it going to take to get tribes to work together in this endeavor of hemp cultivation and production, and keep it of a circular model, And so we have some different ideas. We're going to be doing some more surveying, but in the meantime, we are going to keep, amplifying our message for that protection of tribal sovereignty in federal legalization. Developing pilot projects in coordination with some of our partners for some of the farming programs on both the hemp cultivation side for seed access, for like long fiber, high quality seed access from other nations where they've been doing this for quite some time, and just looking at ways to build solutions for tribes with the new green revolution in hemp. And I would love to entertain any questions. I see that we had some in the chat as well. And so.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Mary Jane. So we have what we were able to accomplish is that the Canadian company left. Oh, that was for uranium. Sorry. I'm from Alaska. I'm not aware of $1 million single family home, especially being funded by government money.
Oh, I would love to share those CARES Act funds. It's actually, it's all public information and online. And I wish I had those that actual budget report, because I could tell you exactly which tribal villages they are. And I do know that a lot of that is because of the rising cost of housing. But there's 3 rounds under the housing funds, and the first, second, and third rounds, the spread of funding available and what the actual build out was going to be for was it's really concerning. It's really concerning. And if you send me that information of who asked that question, I will send them over all 3 of those budget. But I mean, you can find all 3 rounds of the funding directly to tribes under the CARES Act and see it in black and white.
Thank you, Mary Jane. I will definitely send that to you so you can follow up with them. Are there any other questions for Mary Jane? There is one. Are hemp farming being lax in states versus reservations?
Yes and no. I mean, the way that they have tribes reporting under the Farm Bill, kind of has them a bit more autonomous than how it's working within the state system. Like here in Idaho, we still have not implemented our hemp plan because we do not have our Department of Agriculture created yet under the Tribal Law and Order Code. And the state's Department of Agriculture is moving so fast, so far forward, that we had tribal members trying to, well, we'll just get a state plan. Well, there's just too much complexity involved there, because they would be trying to get a state plan to farm on tribal trust lands. And those types of nuances have not even been discussed. And then we have other alternate to that, people wanting to know, will we be able to, since we live on the reservation, can we get a tribal plan instead of a state plan? And can we get a tribal license? Those questions, I mean, there's just still so much that they didn't think about in terms of checkerboard reservation, hemp cultivation.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's see. And we don't have any other questions.